So basically, all these are known as packaging disorders because, like, when the child is in the mother's womb, so any external influence or a maternal influence or a genetic influence can affect the outcome. So if the packaging is faulty, the outcome is also faulty. So considering that we have a group of disorders known as packaging disorders that includes congenital muscular torticollis, metatarsus adductus clubfoot, congenital knee dislocation, and DDS. So whenever you see a child with deformities of the limbs, especially the lower limbs, so we always have to consider it as, it could be a part of a packaging disorder and examine, from head to toe. You examine the hip, knee, foot, spine, and including upper limb because it may not present as a single entity and could be seen along with all the other, DDH might be seen with congenital dislocation of the knee or with clubfoot. So always examine from head to toe. So first I'll come to DDH, also known as developmental dysplasia of the hip. So previously it used to be known as congenital dislocation of the hip, but eventually they realized that not all children have dislocation at birth, and some children may not have dislocation per se, but might have just some amount of subluxation or dysplasia. So they changed the term to DDH, which is known as developmental dysplasia of the hip. So CDH is no longer used. So it has a spectrum of conditions which can vary from mild dysplasia to subluxation, that is the joint is slipping out, to a frank dislocation. Also, there can be a teratological hip dislocation that is seen that is mainly the hip is dislocated since birth, mainly seen in arthrogryposis, meningomyelocele, Larsen syndrome, ED syndrome, and most of these teratological hips being dislocated from birth are very difficult to reduce it back. Some people may not have any symptoms of DDH at birth and all, but later on, as it starts growing, there might be some amount of small amount of dysplasia, discrepancy in the bone anatomy, which might present later, and they might slowly subluxate or dislocate later in the age. That's why it's known as developmental dysplasia rather than congenital dislocation. So the incidence of dysplasia is as high as 1 per 100 live births, whereas dislocation is 1 per 1000. It is more commonly seen in females and most common in Native Americans because they have the habit of tying up the child in a sheet with both the limbs adducted, like as seen in the picture. And most commonly, the left hip is affected, and 20% have bilateral involvement. When we come to India, the incidence of DVH is quite high, has 18 per 1000 live births. This is according to a study done in Vellore, which showed that almost 10.5% of the newborns had abnormal hips. So, what are the risk factors for DVH? Firstly, the firstborn, because usually during the first pregnancy, the musculature of the uterus is quite strong and sturdy, and it causes some amount of compression for the child. It's not lax. And secondly, female gender itself, because the circulating estrogen of the female fetus plus the maternal estrogen amounts to increased laxity, therefore causing higher risk of DVF in females. And breech presentation, mainly seen in frank and not much seen in footlings. Frank breech wherein both hip and knee is extended high up. Even family history, 30% of people with family history of DVH tend to develop DVH. And also oligohydramnios is another risk factor for DVH. So coming to the etiology, there are various risk factors which contribute. One is the genetic factor. There's no pinpoint genetic cause for DVH, but when associated with other syndromes such as Larsen, arthrogryposis, they act as an influencing factor. Another factor is a theory is hormonal factors. During pregnancy, there is a hormone called relaxin which is circulating in the blood. So due to which there is a chance of the hip getting dislocated. That is another theory that is being said. Another is a mechanical factor which is mainly intrauterine malposition or oligohydramnios, which cause constriction of the space, therefore causing the hip to dislocate. Apart from that, there can be a primary dysplasia, that is the child itself has disorder of the bone, which might cause dysplasia of the hips and the pelvis, causing the hip dislocate. And postnatal factors such as the way they take care of the child. A lot of people have the habit of binding the child in a cloth with both the legs adducted. But whereas we see less of this in Africans as well as some amount in Indian parents, working parents, because they tend to carry the child with the hips abducted. So what is the pathology that we see in DDH? Usually at birth, there's not much significant changes because it's still a nascent hip. So at birth, what we see is mainly a stretched capsule. This capsule is lax and stretched, and the ligamentum teres is elongated. The femoral head is fairly normal, but once the child starts to walk, starts bearing weight, starts crawling, that's when the effect of weight bearing and the effect of deviance is seen. So changes intensify after the child weight bears. There's usually a formation of false acetabulum. The musculature tends to become taut and tight, and the articular cartilage is destroyed. So as the child starts walking, eventually down the years, the hip completely dislocates, and there is a fat collection in the acetabulum. Once the head is out, there's empty space which is filled by unwanted tissue and fat, which is known as vulvar tissue. The ligaments which are in the hip, the ligamentum teres and the transverse acetabular ligament, they tend to become more thick. And what we notice is the iliopsoas, which is acts as a constricting muscle. So the capsule being lax, hip being dislocated, the iliopsoas is stretched, so it causes the hourglass kind of a constriction. So this makes the hip difficult to pull it back. So it acts like an obstructive structure in between. So apart from that, the bone undergoes femoral anteversion. That is, the normal anteversion is about 40 degrees. So it is more anteriorly tilted, the femoral head compared to the shaft. Then there is increased acetabular anteversion, and there's increased obliquity of the pelvis. So the whole, once the hip is out, there's no normal forces acting, and therefore they all start remodeling in their own fashion, and the head starts to, becomes much flatter. There'll be a, pseudo acetabulum that is being formed. So a lot of bony changes and soft tissue changes eventually take place as the age increases. So how do you diagnose? Clinically, we usually bring the child, say about, usually the parents don't notice it till the child starts walking. So once the child starts walking, they notice that there is some discrepancy in the limb length, and they notice that the child is having some kind of a limp. So they bring the child saying, the child is limping, I see one limb is shorter. So clinically, there are different tests which can be done at different ages. Usually they present some of them if they are diagnosed by a pediatrician or by a surgeon or they bring the child earlier. So when the child is got less than 3 months, the three main tests that we do is Barlow, Ortolani, and Galeazzi test. I'll get to them in detail. Then between 3 years to 1 year, you need to look for limitations of hip abduction, any limb discrepancy, and there's a test known as Smith test. So a child presenting greater than 1 year of age, you need to look for pelvic obliquity, any deformities of the spine, look for Trendelenburg gait, and if the child is slow walking on the affected side. So coming to a younger child, what we notice on inspection is the affected side. Here on the left side, we see that the creases are much deeper compared to the opposite side. And also we can notice that the limb length is shorter on the affected side. Now, in such children, when you try to abduct the hip on the affected side, here on the right side, you can notice that the examiner is not able to abduct, whereas on the normal side, the examiner is able to abduct the hip completely. So these are the most important tests that anyone can do even without much knowledge about DDH. It's easily detectable. So coming to Barlow and Ortolani, which is the most important test, which is usually done in less than 3 months. After 3 months, these tests have no significance because the musculature tends to contract and you don't get a true positivity after 3 months of age. So Barlow or Bahar low in Hindi is where you dislocate the hip. So the examiner adducts the hip, that is, gets the thighs together while applying a posterior force. This is done with the hip and knee flexion. So when you do that, you'll hear a click and the hip dislocates out. So that is known as Barlow's test. So basically, you're dislocating the hip, which you can feel with a click. Now, Ortlani is where you want to put it back in. So the examiner, you do the exactly opposite to what you do in Barlow. In Ortlani, you abduct the hip while applying a gentle upward traction. So the joint comes back into place. Again, with the click, it goes in. So you can do this at getting the thighs together with posterior force dislocates the hip. Abducting the thighs with a long upward traction brings the hip back into place. So this is the most important test up to 3 months of age. Now, after 3 months, you need to look for Galeazzi sign. That is, if you look from the foot end of the patient with the hip and knee flex, you can notice that there will be a discrepancy when you draw parallel lines to both the knees. So the affected side being shorter will be lower. One more test which is done especially if the child has bilateral BDH, you may not, and when you're not able to get Barlow's or Ortlani test to be done. So you can do this test known as twist test, wherein you keep your middle finger over the GT, that is the greater trochanter, and your index finger over the anterior superior iliac spine. So now draw an imaginary line. In case it is a normal hip, you can see this imaginary line touch the umbilicus or go above the umbilicus. Whereas in case of a dislocated hip, you'll realize that the GP moves up because it's dislocated and the line, the imaginary line passes below the umbilicus. So this is a child with BDH. So you can notice the limb. This is known as the Trendelenburg gait, wherein the whole pelvis tilts downwards, including the shoulder on the affected side. So if you notice the left shoulder and the left pelvis tilts downwards. This is known as Trendelenburg gait. So Trendelenburg sign is again an extension of Trendelenburg gait. That is, instead of making the child walk, first you make the child stand on the normal limb. Look at the pelvis. Usually when the child stands on a normal limb, the pelvis lifts up. Whereas in case of once the child stands on the affected limb, the pelvis droops down. So this is known as Trendelenburg sign. Also, you'll notice that such children will have an exaggerated lumbar lordosis. The lumbar curvature is exaggerated. So what are the investigations that we need to do when we suspect ADS in children? First is you need to do a X-ray AP frog leg of the pelvis. If the child is very young and you're not able to, you don't want to expose the child to X-ray, then you can consider doing USG when the child is as young as 6 months or less than 3 months. And USG is also useful in younger children because the proximal epiphysis of the femur is not there or it doesn't appear at such early ages, so it might be a little difficult to read the X-ray. Other option is CT, which is not done much. MRI is also not required most of the time. So X-ray and USG are the main diagnostic tools. Coming to X-ray, how do you diagnose DH? So basically, you have two basic lines that you need to draw on the X-ray. First is known as the Hilgen-Reners line, that is the H here. It's basically a horizontal line drawn between the two triradiate cartilage. So the triradiate cartilage is here and here, so you draw a horizontal line between both of them. So that is the first Hilgen-Reners line. Now next you need to draw Perkins line, which is the perpendicular line to the outermost part of the acetabulum. So you look for the acetabulum, the outermost part of the acetabulum here. So you draw a perpendicular line to the Hilgen-Reners line. So once you draw these two lines, you have four quadrants. The inner lower quadrant, lower outer quadrant, upper inner quadrant, and upper outer quadrant. So in a normal hip, the head is supposed to be in the inner medial quadrant here. But whereas in BDH, it can be seen in any of the other two, that is, it is seen in the outer quadrants. that is beyond the Perkins line. So apart from that, you have something known as Shenton's line. Shenton's line is a line drawn from the superior pubic rami towards the lower border of the neck of femur. So you can see this curved line. Whereas in BDH, this curved line, or whenever the hip is dislocated, is broken. So this is another easy way to diagnose BDH. One more way is you get a frog-leg view and you draw this von Rothen's line that is basically a perpendicular straight line through the neck of femur. When you draw the straight line through the neck of femur, it should bisect or go through the triradiate cartilage. If it doesn't go through the triradiate cartilage, that is, it goes above it, that means the hip is dislocated. So again, these summating, you can see the normal and the abnormal side. So when you draw these two lines in a dislocated hip, the head is usually outside the lower middle quadrant. Here you can see it in the upper quadrant. Whereas on this side, it's in the normal side. Again, the Shenton's line is broken here. So you have something known as acetabular index apart from that. That is the angle formed by the is also increased in case of a DDH, which you can see here. So in younger children, we prefer to do something known as ultrasound examination, wherein the radiologist measures the acetabulum has a bony acetabulum as well as a cartilaginous acetabulum. So usually when the cartilaginous acetabulum is more or the bony acetabulum is less, that's when the hip dislocates. So they measure something known as alpha and the beta angle. So alpha angle is the measure of the bony acetabulum and beta is the measurement of the cartilaginous acetabulum. So normal hips have a higher alpha angle as great as 55, whereas beta angle is less. So alpha angle greater than 60 and beta angle less than 55 is normal. That is, the bony acetabulum is deeper, so it will hold the hip well in place. As the alpha angle reduces and beta angle increases, the risk of subluxation or dislocation increases. So how do we screen patients with BDH? So any patients with having the risk factors or any of the positive clinical findings, it is advisable to do a ultrasound examination. And in case you find that in the ultrasound examination the hip is inside, or it's just a mild subluxation, that is, there's delayed ossification, alpha angle is still around the border, even the beta angle is around 55 to 70%, then you can still wait and do the USG at every 4 and 6 weeks or every month and see if it is progressing. If it is not progressing, you need not worry. In case it is progressing, then you have to keep as per DDH protocols. And just one examination may not be required, may not be sufficient. You have to do a repetitive screening, especially if the child is younger. So once diagnosed BDH, what do you want to do? So the treatment depends on the age. The later they present, the more complex the treatment becomes. And if they present to us after, say, 8 years or 9 years, we don't even touch the hip. We just treat it conservatively or do more of a salvage surgery than treating the main BDH. So when they present to us in early ages, that is 0 to 6 months, we usually treat them with Pavlik harness, or we attempt a close reduction and apply hip spica. All of y'all must have seen hip spica. So 0 to 6 months, it's usually close reduction, or mostly if the patient can afford a Pavlik harness, which costs around 5 to 6,000 rupees, we advise Pavlik harness, or else preferably do a close reduction and apply a hip spica. Now, between after the age of 1 year, the tissue starts maturing and it becomes more and more difficult for us to reduce the hip. In such cases, we do a open reduction of the hip. After the open reduction, we again put the child on a spica for about 3 months of time. Now, if they present to us after 1.5 years, after 2 years, so apart from the soft tissue being mature, even the bone would have overgrown. So in such cases, we might have to do an open reduction and probably shorten the femur. We usually do shorten the femur in case it is too long. Then if we present after 3 years of age, along with open reduction, femoral shortening, we have to add a pelvic osteotomy to contain the hip because the bone development is good up to 5 years of age. After 5 years, it becomes more and more difficult for the bone to develop. So this is a Pavlik harness which we usually use up to 6 months of age, wherein this it's made up of Velcro material. This holds the hip in abduction, flexion, and internal rotation. So this helps the hip to go back into place. But this has a risk of AVN, that is avascular necrosis of femur. It can cause a transient femoral nerve palsy and also known as something known as a Pavlik's disease, where the posterior wall of acetabulum, because of the constant pressure, becomes dysplastic or kind of disappears. So it makes it more unstable. So I forgot to tell you about USG prenatally. What do we do? Certain people are diagnosed prenatally and they say that hip is dislocated or might be dislocated. So usually sometimes the parents come and ask, what do we do? So you can always convince them as long as there's no other abnormalities. Usually they scan for all the other abnormalities. If there's no other abnormalities, DBH can easily be treated post-birth by simple non-invasive techniques. But if it is associated with other conditions such as renal agenesis, bowel bladder thing, or even the spinal deformity, then there is always a syndromic association, and it is better to consider other modalities than taking the pregnancy further in such cases. Now, is a spica which we usually do up to 1.5 years of age. Now, if they present to us after 1.5 years of age, we do something known as open reduction. Open reduction can be done either by a medial approach or an anterior approach. Anterior approach is known as a Smith-Peterson approach, or we also call it as a bikini incision. Bikini incision because the incision is along the crease of the groin and is hidden under the underwear of the child as the child grows. So it is usually not seen. So once we do the bikini incision, we go between the plane of tensor fascia lata and sartorius, approach the hip through that. We release the iliopsoas, we release the rectus muscle, then we open the capsule in an inverted T-shaped manner. And once the capsule is open, we visualize the head and remove the pulvinar tissue. The labrum is left intact, the joint capsule is open. As I said, iliopsoas is divided. We transverse acetabular ligament and the ligamentum teres is removed because they act as an obstruction for the head to go back in because they are hypertrophy. So all these are done, and then in case the child is above 2 years, we do a femoral shortening and then pull the head back into the hip and suture back the capsule, do a capsularrhaphy. So this is about open reduction of the hip. This is showing a femoral shortening. Basically, the femur is overgrown, so we usually shorten it by 2.5 inches, so it comes back to its normal position and sits inside the acetabulum. Apart from that, if we present to us more than 3 or 4 years later, we have to also add a pelvic acetabulum, as I told you before. There are various pelvic acetabulum depending on the severity. The most commonly is the San Diego, Degas, and Pemberton osteotomy, wherein the iliac blade is, we just elevate the outer crest of the iliac blade and create like a shelf, like a structure over the acetabulum. So it acts like a roof. It is not creating a extra acetabulum, but it just gives a roof over the present acetabulum, so it prevents the head from again migrating superiorly. So this is about DDH. Next, I'll move on to CTEV. Any questions about DDH, or shall I go ahead?
Abhishek, I appreciate it. In fact, it was very interesting, very exhaustive. What I would like is, since the exam going pages are there, can you just give a summary of it straight? For example, the keywords that they need to know. Okay, like DDH, the etiology, then investigation, like you said, Barlow's test, Ottolini's test, and put this thing, just 3-4 things, and then investigations, X-ray, ultrasound, CT, whatever,
Okay.
utility.
Yes, sir.
Treatment wise,
So,
younger age, harness, older age. You just summarize that so that is what is more important for them.
yes, sir.
I hope I
So,
made my point clear.
yes, sir.
Thank you.
So basically, when they ask you about DDH, so first thing you need to define what DDH is. DDH is not just dislocation; it's a developmental dysplasia of the hip, which comprises a spectrum of conditions which can include subluxation, dislocation, or just mild dysplasia. So there are various risk factors or causes that can be associated, such as female gender or oligohydramnios and any other congenital causes, syndromic causes. So mainly the clinical symptoms include altered gait, limb length discrepancy, and limping in the child. So whenever you see such a child, you need to do investigations such as mainly the X-ray and the ultrasound. Ultrasound is mainly done in children less than 3 months of age, where the bones are not well developed, and X-ray is done after 3 months of age. So in the X-ray, main 2 points you need to look for is you draw the Wilson-Diaz line and the Coffin line and see where the head is located. In USG, you measure for the alpha and the beta angle, which measures the bony and the cartilaginous acetabulum. So mainly the bony acetabulum should be bigger. So also they do a dynamic test in USG. They see if the hip is going out. So once you diagnose, say, DDH with the X-rays and the ultrasound, treatment is based on age. Up to 6 months of age, we treat it with fabric harness. 6 months to 1.5 years of age, we treat it with attempts of dose reduction with hip spike application. If it doesn't yield to dose reduction or the child presents after 1.5 years of age, we have to go ahead and do open reduction of the hip either through an anterior or a medial approach. Anterior approach is much safer because we avoid all the major structures and we are able to visualize the whole hip per se. And if the child presents much late after 3 years, we have to also include femoral shortening along with open reduction. Each child after 5 years of age, apart from femoral shortening, we also have to include pelvic mastectomy. Now, after all these surgeries, the child is put under 3 months, and after 3 months, we put the child on a brace, a hip abduction brace. Subsequently, we taper it down, and the child can walk normally. Complications of DDH can include arthritis, avascular necrosis. These are the main complications that we can see in DDH. If they present way later in the pregnancy after 9 years, we do salvage such as total hip replacement later in life. So this is a gist about DDH. So next I move on to clubfoot. So clubfoot, also known as congenital fallacy equinovarus. So why is it known as clubfoot? Because it resembles the club of golf game. So there are it is again it's a range of deformities. It is not just maxillary deformity. It includes cavus, forefoot adductus, hindfoot varus, and equinus. So all these together, a mnemonic is known as CAVE. CAVE. So cavus, forefoot adductus, varus, and equinus. Varus, adductus, and a cavus. So it's the most common skeletal deformity that we see at birth. The incidence is as high as 1 per 1,000. It's more highest seen in Hawaiians and more predominantly in the males. Most of the time, half of the cases, they have bilateral involvement. Uh, in 80%, the clubfoot can be an isolated deformity as well. So the exact cause of clubfoot is not known. There are various theories that have come up for it. One is the germ defect theory, which they say that there is some developmental defect in the bones or the soft tissues in the foot which causes the deformity. Some say there is an arrest in the development which causes the deformity. Whereas another theory is there could be a imbalance in the neuromuscular signaling or a neural tube defect could be the cause for it. And another cause is postal deformity, probably due to oligohydramnios or twin pregnancies due to the lack of space. the foot is pressed against the inside of the uterus, so that can cause the deformity. So these are the various theories which have been proposed. Associated condition is quite huge. They can be associated with arthrogryposis, tibia hemimelia, amniotic band syndrome, Larsen syndrome, MMC. So broadly, we classify clubfoot as idiopathic and non-idiopathic. Idiopathic is where there's no known cause, and non-idiopathic comprises the syndromic clubfoot, neurological clubfoot, and the postural clubfoot. So the syndromic mainly includes the children with arthrogryposis, Larsen syndrome, whereas neurological includes MMC or any other CP children, cerebral palsy, or neuromuscular disorders. So basically, I'll come to the pathophysiology. You have there is soft tissue components as well as bony components. The soft tissue components include the cavus, forefoot, adductor, varus, and equinus, which is caused due to the tightness of various tendons, mainly the tendoachilles, the tibialis posterior, tibialis anterior tendon, and the flexor hallucis group, the both longest and the digitorum tendons. Whereas the bony deformities that we see is basically uh, the tala neck. There's a deformity in the talus, there's a deformity in the calcaneum, and there's deformity in the navicle. These three bones are mainly affected. So we see the severe tibio-talar-plantar flexion. That is, the ankle is in equinus, and there is subluxation of the talonavicular joint. The talonavicular joint subluxates. The shape of the talus changes. There's a wedge shaping of the talus, and apart from that, the navicle seems to be dislocated. So these are the main things that you need to know. And the cuboid is medially displaced. So main thing that here that we need to understand is the talonavicular joint is subluxated or dislocated, and the talar anatomy is distorted. So this is again the same thing. So clinically, what we notice on examination, apart from the the foot is usually small compared to the normal size. The calf is usually hypoplastic. The tibia, the whole leg, is usually shortened. Apart from that, you can look for the equinus deformity, the medial crease, the posterior crease, and when you palpate the heel, it appears like a soft cushion where you don't palpate for any bone. The bone is quite high riding. So how do we differentiate between a true CTV and a postal CTV is when you manipulate, you try to dorsiflex the foot as seen in the picture. If you're able to dorsiflex beyond neutral as seen in the picture, it is not a clubfoot, it is a postural clubfoot. So postural clubfoot doesn't require any treatment, whereas a true clubfoot might require treatment. Now you can detect clubfoot prenatally. Usually scans done if it is detected in first trimester, it is usually associated with other anomalies. So it is mostly a syndromic clubfoot. And if it is detected in first trimester with other anomalies, we usually advise the parents, you can consider termination of pregnancy provided the child has other associated anomalies which is life-threatening or which requires lot of care and can significantly alter the child's lifestyle post-birth. Now, in case it is detected in the second trimester, they are typically true clubfoot or idiopathic clubfoot, which may not be associated with any other condition. If detected in the third trimester, it is usually a false positive, probably because of intrauterine crowding. So USG is more sensitive in the second trimester. If diagnosed in first trimester, it's usually a syndromic cause. Investigations, usually this is a clinical diagnosis. We don't usually ask for X-rays or any scans, but you can always ask for X-ray, but they are of least importance. So the aim of treating a clubfoot is to produce a planting-made supple foot that will function well. That is basically you don't want a 100% normal foot, but you just need a foot on which the child can walk normally. So there are various treatments. You have the non-operative and the operative. The non-operative includes Ponseti method. Operative includes posterior medial soft tissue release, medial opening or lateral column shortening, that is basically osteotomy, various osteotomies that we do. We also do Ilizarro correction of the deformity. Sometimes if they present too late, very late in age, we do a triple arthrodesis. So the mainstay of treatment is Ponsati's method. So before we go into Ponsati's method, we do something known as Pirani scoring. So it was developed by Shafiq Pirani, an Indian. So wherein we score the foot based on the severity of the deformity. So we have a midfoot contracture score and a hindfoot contracture score, which respectively have curved lateral border, medial crease, lateral head of talus, posterior crease, rigid equinus, and empty heel. So we measure each of these and score the foot accordingly. So I'll not go into much details of this. Each of it is scored from 0 to 0.5 and 1 being more severe and 0 being absence of all these. So as I said, 0 to 1. So 1 being more severe, 0 being normal. So each of them are scored and we have a total score of 6. Depending on that, 6 out of 6 is a severe club foot. As the Pirani score reduces, it is a less severe club foot. So what is the use of Pirani score? It helps us to measure the severity. It helps us to assess the progression as we treat. So this is the overview of treatment that we do for clubfoot. So initially when the child comes with suspected clubfoot, we do a head-to-toe examination for the foot based on Pirani score, classify the clubfoot as either idiopathic, secondary or non-idiopathic, either symptomatic or neurogenic, and there's a separate entity called the atypical clubfoot, which is a much more complex clubfoot. I'll not go into atypical. In idiopathic and non-idiopathic clubfoot, the first line of treatment is Ponsati casting. So we do Ponsati casting, which where we apply, it is a manipulation and casting, which subsequently improves over time. Usually the first cast, as I said, there are 4 deformities, C, A, V, E. And the correction also goes in the same order. First we treat the cavus, then we go for the adduction and the varus, and finally we treat the equinus. So depending on the severity, the child might require, say, about 6 to 8 casts, wherein we slowly manipulate the foot. That is, we basically abduct the foot and supinate the foot while applying the cast. Once we attain a good Pirani score, that is a score of less than 2, we do a percutaneous stenotomy. This attains to the last deformity. So cavus, adduction, and varus is corrected by casting, and equinus is corrected by doing a percutaneous stenotomy, which is done in the OPD. So after the percutaneous stenotomy, we put the child on a full-time brace for 24 hours up to 3 months of age, following which we reduce the bracing time to 12 hours, and subsequently we continue up to 5 years. So this is the overview of treatment of clubfoot under Ponsati treatment. Now, in patients where despite applying plasters, it's not budging, it's very rigid. In such patients, we do uh, surgical management. That is basically we do a posterior PMS care, posterior medial soft tissue release, wherein we release all the tight structures such as the posterior tibialis, the tendo achilles, the posterior capsule, the talonavicular joint capsule, the ankle capsule. So all these soft tissues are released and the foot is brought to its desirable position, and then we suture back all the tendons. So the main tendon here that we lengthen is the tendo Achilles and the tibialis posterior. Sometimes the flexor hallucis and the flexor digitorum tendons are also lengthened. Apart from that, we do something known as Ilizarro, that is external fixator frame which we apply on the child, and subsequently with use of there are various hinges here which we rotate, and eventually in a span of 1 or 2 months, the foot is back to normal. Now, in a very late presenting case, that is the child presents to us after 12 years of age, we have no option but to do corrective osteotomy and fuse the joint. So we fuse we do something known as triple arthrodesis, wherein we use the talocalcaneal, talonavicular, and the calcaneal cuboid joint to give a normal foot, wherein it will be a rigid foot. So this is about clubfoot. So clubfoot is basically comprising of four deformities, that is the cavus, forefoot adductus, equinus, and the hindfoot varus. So the cave. So it can be idiopathic or non-idiopathic. Idiopathic is where the cause is not known. Non-idiopathic is where it can be either a syndromic cause or a neurogenic cause. Now, coming to the treatment, irrespective of the age, the first line of treatment is quantity treatment as long as they present early. So if they present within 1 year, quantity works miracles, and by manipulative fasting, we are able to completely correct the foot to normal. We do a percutaneous sternotomy at the end of fasting, and we put the child on a brace up to 5 years of age. Now, in children where quantity fasting fails, or the foot is very rigid, or they present to us very late, we go for surgical line of management, which mainly includes posterior medial soft tissue relief, that is PMSPR, or in a slightly older child, we go for Ilizaro ring fixators. In a very late presenting, we have to do bony osteotomy and triple arthrodesis. So this is a gist about your foot. Any questions?
Abhishek, a fantastic presentation. My question is, see, the Ponseti method that we are following in the institute has got fantastic results. I accept it. But is it worldwide the standard treatment right now,
Yes,
standard
sir.
of care, or other things are also being practiced?
Uh, it's a standard protocol for care, sir. All clubfoots are initially treated by Ponseti. It's
Now, that is
gold
the one which is
standard now.
gold standard across the country, is it?
Across the
Huh?
world, sir.
Across the
Now,
world.
even
Fantastic.
some of them claim that even the most rigid clubfoot, they claim they have a good rate as much as 80% are being treated by just Ponseti method.
Okay, okay, okay. So, okay. So, they will not be penalized if they say this is a method. That's the right thing to do. Okay, I got it. Good.
No, sir.
Jagu, Sridhar,
This is the
and
right thing to
Venkatesh.
provide play.
Come again? We can't hear you, Abhishek.
Nothing. Nothing, sir. Nothing.
Okay, Venkatesh, Sridhar, and Jagu, if you have anything, please ask. Otherwise, you let him continue, please.
Continue, sir. Continue.
Continue, sir.
So next, I'll move on to the next packaging disorder, which is known as congenital dislocation of the knee, also known as congenital hyperextension of the knee. So again, it's a spectrum of disease where you can have a positional contracture, that is because of the position in the abdomen, the hip or the knee is hyperextended, or it can be a rigid dislocation. So it is most commonly seen in children with MMC, arthrogryposis, and Larsen syndrome. So based on the severity, they are classified as uh, uh, type 1, type 2, and type 3. Type 1 being a simple retrogression, that is, they just have a simple hyperextension. Type 2 is where there is some slight subluxation of the knee, and type 3 where there's a frank dislocation. So, what are the problems in such knees? What is the pathology? The main pathology is the contracture of the quadriceps tendon, so which is pulling the knee to hyperextension. Due to this hyperextension, the hamstrings, which are posteriorly placed, tend to subluxate anteriorly, and the suprapatellar pouch disappears, and the ligaments tend to become tight in that position. So basically, on examination, we see that the child will present to us with a hyperextended knee. You can notice that the femoral condyles will be more prominent on the posterior aspect. When you try to flex such knee, you will not be able to flex it. Sometimes you can see some amount of dimpling or creases in the anterior surface of the knee, like as seen here. And always in such children, examine the hip, the foot, because it can be associated with disease. So what do we do for such children? Mainly, the treatment is non-operative treatment. Almost 80% of children we go for non-operative treatment. Similarly, like Ponseti, we do a manipulative fasting where we flex the knee gradually. Initially, we get it with infill. Subsequent casting, we increase the flexion. So initially, we try to attain a goal of 30 degrees. Once we attain a goal of 30 degrees, we might have to do a percutaneous quadriceps tenotomy. So the mainstay of treatment is casting. Now, in case of children who have DDH, club foot, and dislocated knee all in one, in such children, first we attend to the knee, and then we move to the foot, and finally we move to the hip. So, in children where repeated manipulative casting is not yielding any results, in such cases, we go ahead and do a open reduction. So, in open reduction, what we do is we do so this is the image showing casting. So failure of attaining flexion of more than 30 degrees despite casting or in a very severe form or late presenting dislocated knee, what we do is we do an open reduction, we do a VY quadriceps plasty or a Z lengthening, we release the anterior joint capsule and also the hamstring tendon which are subluxated anteriorly are transpositioned back to their normal position. So collateral, what happens in such children is sometimes, despite doing all this, they have other deformities such as ACL, PCL absence may also be noted in such children. So after doing the open reduction, we put a cast in about 45 to 60 degree of flexion up to 3 to 4 weeks. And then subsequently, we start doing physiotherapy, put them on brace. So the CDK, I'll just summarize CDK. CDK, also known as contentious hyperextension of the knee. They can be of three grades. They can be just mild, hyperextension. It can be a subluxation or a frank dislocation. The main pathology in this is contracture of the quadriceps, anterior transposition of the hamstring, and the contracture of the capsule. So mainstay of treatment presenting early is manipulative casting, wherein we gradually flex the knee and reduce the knee back. We aim to get up to 30 to 40 degrees of flexion. If there's failure to get 30 to 40 degrees of flexion despite casting or the present state, we go ahead and do a surgical soft tissue release, which is mainly quadriceps lengthening procedure. Sometimes if you're able to get 30 to 40 degrees, we go ahead and do a percutaneous quadriceps tenotomy. And we continue the child on brace for a long time. Once the child is bigger, we have to evaluate for other deficiencies such as ACL deficiencies, that is anterior posterior cruciate deficiencies within the knee. So this is about CDK. So all this together is a packaging disorder. Any questions regarding this?
Thank you, Abhishek. I really appreciate the pains that you've taken to explain in simple terms. Now, basically, I want the exam going PGs to ask questions and then the rest of them.
So there is a talk on.
Yeah, there's one more point, is there? Yeah.
So there's another talk on Ebbings that you all had requested. So
yes.
if time permits, we can.
Yeah, we can. Before going further, I thought we'll just ask the PGs if they have any questions to ask.
Yes, sir.
If we finish, then we'll go next.
So RP sir just joined us.
Okay. RP, welcome.
Yeah, hi.
Welcome. Abhishek did a fantastic job.
Yeah. So basically, these are all common problems. I think being pediatric surgeons, one is for their exam is useful. Number two is, some of the situation when they come across, for example, if there is no orthopedic facility, how to manage these things or how to recognize them. Most important is the clinical diagnosis. Clinical diagnosis, especially which is, applicable to DDH, developmental dysplasia of the hip joint. It's called dysplasia because earlier we used to call it as a dislocation. Now, in spite of hip being inside, there can be still problems in the hip joint. That is improper development of the acetabular socket or even the femoral head. So they also needs to be identified. Sometimes they may present having a little bit of subluxation. So what requires is simple Pavlik harness and the diagnosis in terms of clinical examination, like some of the tests what Abhishek was mentioning, and ultrasound scan, which is very useful and can be ordered anywhere else. So DDH is one thing which is important, and of course the dislocation of the knee is another concern, which is quite revealed deformity. It is not a concealed deformity like DDH. So everything you can see, the knee is in awkward position. The hip you cannot see, hip inside. So these are some. Any questions? Any? I mean, did all of you understand the concepts or the points?
Jaggu, Sridhar,
Hello?
and Mantesh, you have to speak up, please.
Yes, sir. We have understood, sir.
Unless you've gone into sleep. Yeah, okay.
no, sir.
That's clear. Tell us if that's fine. So they can go to the next section of the talk.
Yes, sir.
Abhishek, carry on.
Yeah.
Abhishek, carry on.
So few points about Ewing sarcoma. Dr. Abhishek is going to talk.
Yes.
Okay, basically introduction, Ewing sarcoma. Basically, they are a spectrum of disease again, which includes Ewing sarcoma and peripheral neuroectodermal tumors. They form a family of tumors known as Ewing sarcoma family of tumors. They are basically small cell tumors, small round cell tumors. They can be found both in the bone as well as soft tissues of the extremities. Very rarely in the axial skeleton, but can also include the axial skeleton. And both of these are associated with chromosomal translocation T1122. So basically, this translocation leads to formation of a fusion protein, which can be useful in diagnosis of these conditions. Now, Ewing's is typically found in patients aged between 5 to 25 years of age, and it's the second most common malignant tumors in children. Most commonly seen in African Americans and the Chinese, more predominant in the male patients. It is most commonly located in the long bones, the diaphyseal bones, most commonly in the distal femur, proximal tibial, femoral diaphysis, and the proximal humerus. But 5% of them might be presented in the metaphyseal region. Now, most of these children present to us with complaints of pain in the limb, swelling, weight loss, or sometimes they might present to us with a pathological fracture. And often all of these mimic infections. So most commonly we misdiagnose or fail to diagnose Ewing's initially, or we diagnose them as infection, treat them as infection, and later on, come to a diagnosis of Ewing's. Clinically, there's not much pinpoint findings. Mainly they present with swelling, localized tenderness, can be associated with fractures and restricted movements of the joint. So the main challenge in diagnosis is the differential. So they have a very close mirroring to other conditions such as small round cell tumors, such as neuroblastoma, leukemia, eosinophilic granuloma, Ewing's, lymphoma, myeloma. So all of these are small round cell tumors, but they present at different ages. So Ewing's is mainly seen between 5 to 30 years or 5 to 25 years of presentation, whereas the others usually present at lymphoma, myeloma present at a much older age, whereas neuroblastoma and eosinophilic granuloma present at a much younger age. Now, but there is difficulty in differentiating between osteosarcoma and Ewing's, but certain X-ray features can help us differentiate them. Again, osteomyelitis is a differential diagnosis, and most often the most common misdiagnosis is osteomyelitis. We might treat it as osteomyelitis, but later on, say a few months later on, it might turn out to become Ewing's. So investigations play an important role, but again gets us into a soup because same like infections, Ewing's can present with the elevated ESR, elevated WBC, anemia, and elevated CRP. But the differentiating factor is LDH. LDH is elevated in case of Ewing's. And you need to get a blood culture done to rule out infections as well. Sometimes you have to do bone marrow biopsy to rule out other lymphomas and malignancies or to rule out metastasis. Now coming to the X-rays, the most important feature that you note in X-ray is the moth-eaten appearance. Just like how you see leaves with the holes, similarly you'll see punched out lesions in the X-rays as shown in the pointer. Another pathognomic feature is onion peel appearance of the bone, especially in the diaphyseal region. Just like an onion, multiple layers, you see the periosteal, multiple layers of periosteum that is being formed due to the continuous destruction, process of destruction as well as new bone formation. So this is very pathognomic of Ewing's sarcoma. So other investigation include bone scan in case you're suspecting metastasis or multiple sites of involvement. Getting a bone scan will help you pick up hot lesions in other places. Also, getting an MRI is important because Ewing's may not just involve the bone, but sometimes can have soft tissue extension. So to understand the soft tissue extension, you need to know you need to get a MRI done. So once you get all these MRI blood workup done, you need to stage the condition. So we do a staging known as Enneking's staging, wherein we stage the condition into stage 1, 2, and 3. Stage 1 is a low grade with no metastasis. A and B depends whether it's just within the compartment or spreads to the next adjacent compartment. Stage 2 is where it's a high grade tumor with no metastasis, and stage 3 is it can be the low grade or a high grade, but there's presence of metastasis. Now, how do you differentiate Ewing's from other round cell tumors? So you need to do first thing whenever you suspect a tumor, bone tumor. What we do is we do a J needle biopsy and send it for histopathological evaluation, and if necessary, they do a lot of immunostainings. So this is important and helps us to differentiate between the other round cell tumors. So mainly the CD99 is positive in Ewing's, MIC2, Vimentin, and PAS positive. Also, S100 is positive in case of Ewing's. So as seen in this chart, you can see in Ewing's you have PAS, Vimentin, and CD99. Whereas in lymphoma, reticulin is positive, CD45 is positive, CDT is positive. Whereas in neuroblastoma, you see immunostaining for neurofilament. So these stainings help us to differentiate between Ewing's and other round cell tumors. Now, coming to the prognosis is quite guarded. 5-year survival rate for a localized disease is 65 to 80%. In metastatic, it is as low as 25 to 40%. And 10 years survival is 60% for localized disease and 30% in metastatic disease. So what are the factors that help us prognosticate the outcome? Factors which have poor prognosis is a tumor size greater than 8 centimeter, or tumor involving the axial skeleton, that is the spine, the pelvic, or the proximal bones in the extremities have poor prognosis. Older the age of diagnosis and male gender have poor prognosis. And in lab parameters, elevated LDH, lactic dehydrogenase, indicate metastatic or a large tumor, so therefore a poor prognosis. Again, molecular pathology, if there is a T1122 translocation or overexpression of antigen K67 or HER2 are all bad for prognosis. And presence of metastasis, especially lung metastasis, especially in Ewing's, you need to look for lung metastasis because it's the most common site for metastasis. Or if this is, all of these metastases have poor indicator. And usually the main line of treatment is chemotherapy and surgery. In case the patient is not responding to chemotherapy or there's less than 90% of necrosis with chemotherapy, again, that is a poor indicator. Now, coming to treatment, you have a non-operative line of treatment, which mainly includes chemotherapy and radiotherapy. Indication for non-operative is where you have a large non-resectable tumor, or it is in a place where you are not able to access it, such as spinal regions, or wherein you can't operate because it causes a lot of functional deficit. In such cases, you prefer to just treat it by chemotherapy or radiotherapy, or when there is secondary malignancies. But radiation therapy is risky because it can cause secondary malignancies such as osteosarcoma. Operative treatment is indicated and is the standard care in most patients. So usually we start off with the pre-operative chemotherapy, also known as neoadjuvant chemotherapy. The most common used drugs include vincristine, doxorubicin, cyclophosphamide, and dactinomycin. So we usually give a pre-operative for 8 to 12 weeks, followed by which we do a surgical resection, or if required, resect the affected part, and then followed by a maintenance chemotherapy. Now, adjuvant radiation is not necessary as long as you have good margins and good resection, but it is indicated when there is positive post-resection surgical margins, or a patient presenting with a widely metastatic disease, or when there is no response to chemotherapeutic treatment. So the treatment option is mainly we do resection of the tumor. Once we resect it, there's a huge bony gap, which we usually use megaprosthesis as seen in this X-ray. They are megaprosthesis, or sometimes if we do an extensive resection, we do something known as limb rotationoplasty. That is, we rotate the limb. In case the femur is involved, we pull up the whole leg, that is the tibial part, up and attach it to the hip, and rotate it in such a manner that the ankle starts acting like a knee instead of ankle. So these are the main surgeries that we do in Ewing's. But the mainstay is chemotherapy and radiotherapy. So that's it with Ewing's. Any questions?
Abhishek, you said you won't put processes. Will you put the processes immediately after computation, or would you like for the treatment to complete and ensure that there's no local recurrence before going in?
So usually they first get a clear margin. Once they have a negative margin, only then they consider putting a prosthesis. In
So
case
there's going to be
there's
sequential,
no
not a
negative,
simultaneous one.
no. In case we get a negative margin in the first shot, and the child has already been on chemotherapy and has been responding well, and there's no metastasis, then we can consider doing this in the single stage.
Okay.
Depends on the stage of the disease.
Any questions from the exam going PGs or other PGs?
Sir, no, okay, sir. I think these presentations are very helpful for us. I think it is sufficient for our the exam preparation, sir. Thank you, Abhishek.
Welcome.
Vicky, Sridhar? Ramchandra sir, Gopal, and I can see a few more people there. In case any questions, suggestions. RP, any few words?
No, I think from the pediatric surgeon perspective, neuroectodermal tumors are the ones which you people see quite commonly, and especially in the first decade of life, some of the tumors what pediatric surgeons see. And this Ewing sarcoma sometimes resembles certain situations, especially these lymphomas and leukemias. So that's why it is of some importance for, in general, for anybody who are dealing with children. So, and then with respect to other conditions, what we discussed, DDH, most of the things. And CTEV, I think everybody has to remember the present vogue in treatment is Ponseti casting, and it is a totally a conservative, it's a semi-conservative, and which involves a very minimal surgical intervention, unlike olden days where we used to do an extensive posterior medial soft tissue release for a child as early as 3 months, 4 months old. and the results were not so good. So I want all the pediatric surgeons to remember that CTV is managed conservatively nowadays. That is with the casting. The casting is nothing but Ponseti casting principles. It is nothing but weekly interval of change of plasters in a certain way, and then managed the last by a tenotomy, which is also done on the outpatient by a local anesthesia. So, and then it is followed by bracing protocols. So this is all in general they need to remember. I think most of the things are covered very well. If they remember this much, it's practically and even for exams it is useful.
This is a good reminder for me too, because I might be correcting their answer papers too.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
other thing which we must remember as far as clinical knowledge goes is about pyomyositis, which we encounter in
Pyomyositis.
that situation. It is important to make sure that all investigations are done properly and should not rush in to do incision and drainage, especially when you have a lot of fever and inflammatory signs. So important to
Correct,
investigate.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
think it's a very valid point. Very valid point because
Pyomyositis is a very common condition in children. Pyomyositis.
yeah. Especially following some intramuscular injections. So they
No,
should
even
not be considered
spontaneously also they'll get RP. Even
spontaneously also.
spontaneously
Yeah.
also they'll get pyomyositis. Very common in children.
So another situation is following a trauma in children. I've seen some of them having a trauma, and then coming with the history of some swollen bone, or in X-ray also there will be some suspicion whether it's a fracture callus or bone tumor like Ewing. I think all the parameters and all the points which were discussed has to be remembered, like blood investigation, clinical examination, and investigations of importance, like estimation of LDH, alkaline phosphatase. All these things will clarify whether we are dealing with a post-trauma situation. I think differential diagnosis is what is important in Ewing's.
Yes, very
Pyomyositis to
important. Yes,
name few.
yes, I agree. I agree. Other thing
RP,
is tumorous calcinosis. We must know about tumorous calcinosis, which is not a very common condition, but which can be confused with the soft tissue variant of Ewing sarcoma. Tumorous calcinosis, which is basically a metabolic disorder. Tumorous calcinosis.
Correct.
Other thing, RP, I wanted you to cover briefly is about, sometimes I've seen questions on pathological fracture. Can you just briefly tell us what our PG should know about pathological fractures?
Yeah, pathological fractures in children are of importance, especially with the pre-existing bony lesions. So in children, what happens, the important history, what we all concentrate is the history of trauma. So trauma, whether the trauma is a significant trauma or an insignificant trauma is what is important to elicit. So when we are asking, we have to ask whether the child had a fall just by walking around or while playing around. These things really help us. If there is a very trivial trauma, which is not really significant, because the bone is a very hard tissue in the body, it will not just yield, following a simple trauma, unless there is a pre-existing lesions. So some of the common lesions what we see in children is a simple bone cyst. Simple bone cysts are benign tumors which are nothing but empty cavities in the bone. Various reasons are thought of, but their etiology is really not known. But there is a cavity which is typically seen in the metaphyseal regions, metaphyseal-diaphyseal regions, and following a trivial trauma, they can just yield. They can become a fracture. And some other conditions like fibrous dysplasia is another condition which is benign in nature, and so these more common benign bone tumors have to be thought of because they are there inside, but they are never symptomatic. They are walking around, they're playing around, and one fine day they just have a simple trauma and then they fracture and they come to the OPD. So on X-ray we see these fractures with are less aggressive in the X-ray, unlike osteosarcomas. So some other reasons like the lesions like infections and these malignant tumors like even Ewing sarcoma or aneurysmal bone cyst and neuroectodermal tumors sometimes in the bone presenting, and lymphomas, leukemias, they also can present like a pathological fracture. So basically, again, clinical investigation, clinical examination in terms of history and local examination is important, and biochemical markers have to be seen to rule out other conditions. So bone and joint infection is another common issue. Sometimes this chronic osteomyelitis, which are having repeated infections on and off, with the obvious clinical history of on and off surgery, antibiotics, and all this, they also can have pathological fractures. So, in nutshell, pathological fracture means there is a pre-existing disease. More common benign tumors like a simple bone cyst, and some local aggressive tumors like aneurysmal bone cyst, Ewing sarcoma, and these are the fibrous dysplasia and neurofibromatosis. These are some of the conditions I think in general we have to remember. So that's about pathological fractures and pathological fractures.
How do you diagnose? How do you treat it? How do you diagnose? How do you treat
That's
it?
what. In general, any pathological fractures are managed by, most of the time they are operated managed by surgical management, except simple bone cyst. Many a time, simple bone cyst fracture itself is a treatment for a simple bone cyst. We don't do anything except splinting unless there is a gross deformity in the bone. See, generally, the fixations are done in orthopedics to have a good anatomical alignment. If there is a pathological fracture with the anatomy preserved, we just have to splint the limb either by slabs or whatever equipments we have, braces, things like that. So they heal well. Conditions like simple bone cyst, we don't do anything. But conditions like fibrous dysplasia, where they tend to cause more deformity, and if you treat them conservatively, the bone may unite, but unite with a gross deformity. To prevent that, the preferred choice of treatment in general would be intramedullary nails, intramedullary devices, intramedullary appliances, whatever it is. So we have plenty of intramedullary devices now. Now commonly used is there is what is called as a TENS nail. It is nothing but a elastic nails. So they are preferred, but otherwise also intramedullary nails. I think some of you are aware about it. Interlocking nails, if the child is have already attained a growth maturation, because in fixing a long bone, especially with a pathological fracture, things like growth plates are considered so that they are not disturbed when the nail is going inside the bone. So these are some of the issues. So most in general, they are, of course, during the fixation, we take the biopsy, confirm it, and then put the intramedullary devices. So that's how the pathological fractures are managed.
Okay, RP, a small question. See, pathological fracture means there is actually some sort of osteopenia and some sort of weakness in the bone there. With just putting a cast or conventional things, will the healing be the same, or do you require extra time for this, or would you like to augment it with a bone graft or something?
That again depends on
calcium supplements or something.
Yeah, that depends on the situation. For example, if you take a condition of a simple bone cyst, we don't require to do anything unless there is a gross, huge expansile lesion that it takes a lot of time. Then only we prefer a bone grafting. Otherwise, a simple bone cyst, a small cyst doesn't require. And at the same time, there is a tumor like aneurysmal bone cyst, a fibrous dysplasia with a huge, lytic lesion, and we have curated it, and hardly there is a bone tissue. Then we augment it with the bone grafting, either autologous bone grafting or autogenous bone grafting. So this is how it is. Bone grafting is indicated in selected situations.
Now, along with it, we also give some medications, sort of like bisphosphonates, etc., to augment the calcification.
Yes. See, now we as a pediatric orthopedic surgeons, we deal with another common condition, what we call as a osteogenesis imperfecta. So it's a metabolic problem. Yeah, from the beginning, their bones are completely weak. So then we have to augment it with some other hormones. Sometimes calcitonin hormones, parathormones are also preferred. But in general, we work with the endocrinologist in this hospital. But the scope for bisphosphonates, so commonly used bisphosphonates are pamidronate, alendronate. Some of the bisphosphonates are there. So we use them. And of course, calcium supplementation, vitamin D3 corrections are a routine. We have to do it. And if they have, especially common is, if the child is on some anti-epileptic drugs, history like this also have to be taken. This is another situation where we see in cerebral palsy children, where the bones are grossly osteoporotic, and they are quite often managed by neurologists and pediatricians with the anti-epileptic drugs. So as you are aware, most of the anti-epileptic drugs, they can cause severe osteopenia of the bones. So if you don't correct that problem, metabolic problem, simple fixation may not help. So it has to work in conjunction with the other things also.
Okay. That apart, RP, a few other common questions.
Yes, sir.
Common.
Explain to the parents how
Yeah.
to go about it. Like what is the long-term sequelae of how many of them really end up in spine surgeries or things like that? The absence of meningomyelocele, of course. Plain and simple.
Yeah. See, most of these hemivertebra diagnoses are done around 5 to 6 months of anomaly scan, if I'm right. Usually the sonologists don't pick up, they may not be able to pick up the hemivertebras in a much earlier life. So most of these hemivertebras are picked up in something like 4, 5 months, 6 months, like that. So where the termination becomes a question, and parents and even doctors are also confused what to advise the parents. It's the same situation when we get a counseling for CTEV, some conditions like that also, or DDH, some antenatal diagnosis. So in general, the hemivertebras are not so dangerous or so worrisome in general if they are absent with other neurological anomalies. If there is a spina bifida with a hemivertebra, especially the hemivertebra in multiple levels, probably I may not advise to continue pregnancy. But if it is only one level, if it's a one level hemivertebra with the rest of the neurology intact, as the sonologist can assess, and there is no other anomalies associated like visceral or limb anomaly, probably it's wise to continue the pregnancy. And what generally we do is as soon as the baby is delivered, we do simple x-rays, and if required, we go through a routine screening of the spinal cord and brain stem status. If there is no other anomalies, usually these children are followed up for 1 to 2 years, and then these hemivertebras are operated. For example, if there is a hemivertebra is nothing but one side of the vertebra is not developed, so this can cause later a deformity. Deformity can vary again depending on which area the hemivertebra is present. For example, if it is at the junction of the cervico-dorsal spine, or if it is a junction at the dorsal-lumbar spine, they are the ones which are very bad and require certainly surgeries. If a hemivertebra is present in just in the dorsal spine, thoracic spine, one level, and not much of a deformity at birth, probably we screen them every 6 months to 1 year and then follow them up, because the junctional deformities are very bad and requires immediate attention. But as early as 1 year, we go in for a severe deformity, single levels, and then we do what is called as a hemivertebra excision, and then a limited fusion of the vertebra, so which can attend to the deformity. So in a message I can give is single level hemivertebra, nothing to worry, we can continue, or we can counsel the parent to continue pregnancy and it can be attended.
That's very helpful. Thank you so much. And
RP,
which is
Yeah.
might look a little stupid. That last photograph on that slide, it is it's a visual hallucination. I don't know. The foot seems ulta. I mean, can you explain that?
Yeah. Yes. See, this is what is called as a rotation plasty. So the ankle will be working like a knee joint inside the prosthesis. So this is a surgery which we rarely do. This is done in two situations. One is, as Abhishek mentioned, that the whole femur is excised. The whole femur was tumorous or very badly affected with the wings or whatever tumor. It is one of the limb salvage procedures, in the partial limb salvage procedures where total amputation can be avoided. And here the limb is purposely rotated to 180 degree. So what happens here, the ankle, because ankle has got a dorsiflexion, the knee has got a flexion. So the ankle, the dorsiflexion of the ankle will work like a knee flexion after that inside the prosthesis. So it is not without that. So obviously that photo is put so that you can understand it is going to be with the prosthesis. They can't walk like that. So, but of course, this involves a lot of psychological counseling, and acceptance is also not so common and good with the patients. So that is what is called as a rotation plasty, which is done in some of the congenital absence of the femur, or the whole femur being excised post-operatively. That is how it is managed.
Thank you so much.
Okay. RP, before we end up, I want you to say a few words on some rare questions, but I've seen that coming in MCH exams are one, osteoid osteoma, two, exostosis, three, osteogenesis imperfecta, four, arthrogryposis multiplex congenita. Can you just tell us some take-home messages on these points?
Yeah, see, the one common thing is about arthrogryposis multiplex congenita, this AMC, what we call, is one of the common, I can't say common, but it's one of the congenital problem are associated with some of the deformities we get. It is basically the muscle tissues are replaced by fibrous tissue. So there is no active muscle tissue. So if you remember, muscle is an elastic tissue. Where there is no elasticity in the joints, the joints go into a contracture stage. So if it is in a ankle, they may present like a CTEV. If it is at the knee, they may present like a flexion deformity of the knee. If they are at the hip joint, they may present like a flexion deformity at the hip joint. So this basically leaves a joint deformities or joint contractures. So arthrogryposis is a terminology, and there are so many synonyms. Amyoplasia is another thing where absence of the muscles. There are nearly more than 100 or 150 types of AMCs. So depending on distal, proximal type of fibrosis involved, to what extent. So there are so many things in that. But in general, what we see is, concern is the arthrogryposis, which is affecting at the joints. So more commonly lower limb joints, because as you know that lower limb certainly affects the locomotion, and these children may not be able to walk at all. So it requires a very aggressive management in terms of treatment. So in general, as early as possible, we see them. So the conventional plaster application or conservative way of approach is used, like gradual correction of the deformity. And if they come very late, or some of them are very resistant to treatment by plaster application alone, so they may have to be selected for surgery. So, but surgery in general is not a good option, because if you understand, it is not a normal muscle. So on that fibrous tissue, if you put another incision, it leads to more fibrosis, and more contractures can be there. So there are methods of managing these things, like gradual corrections like Ilizarov, or with some external fixators, some bony procedures, like, because when you shorten the bone, the joint contracture can be corrected to some extent. So there are many ways of managing it, but in general, you have to remember that it is a amyoplasia or a muscle pathology, and then they are managed by, depending on the area. For example, if it is a knee, so we gradually correct with the plaster application. The same thing to CTEV presented in case of AMC. And if they are resistant, then only we go for surgical intervention. So surgical intervention will be, soft tissue releases, because when we open them, there's hardly any anatomy we can recognize. Most of the tissues are looking very fibrous, very pathological, and so the deformity correction will be more important here than the muscle functioning and all those things. So with surgery, it's not that they are going to become normal, but from what they were, it is going to be a better limb. So that's how we manage the arthrogryposis. And with respect to osteogenesis imperfecta, this is another condition where it's also it's something like in children brittle bone disease. There are two types in broad category. One is what is called as a tarda, and one is called as a congenita. Osteogenesis imperfecta congenita, most of these babies are stillborn, because they just during the delivery or in utero, because of the skull fractures, or during the birth process, they succumb and they don't survive. Very rarely they survive, and they can have multiple fracture even if they survive in chest cage, long bones and things like that. But if they survive, or if there is another variety, what's called the tarda. So here usually they come very late with a pathological fracture. As we discussed the pathological fracture earlier, a mother is handling the baby just for breastfeeding. There is a fracture. They come here, and again we work up for other conditions, and then deformity correction is what is important. But they are managed in general after 1 year only, because Till then, the nutrition and other things takes the priority. Metabolic workup is required. And once they set up with that, usually these fractures heal very fast. The healing is no problem. So they have multiple fractures, but they have a good healing time also. Within few weeks, the bones unite. But during the union, there can be a deformities. In the long bone deformity are the challenges for orthopedic surgeons. And there are so many things. There is good amount of advances are happening now. We have osteogenesis groups which are working together for families and children, and many have grown into adulthood, and they have done great to society also in terms of contribution and settling things like that. So what they require is a good treatment. So long bone deformity corrections are the priority, and we use again intramedullary devices. And one thing I must tell for pediatric surgeons or in general, as a general knowledge, that there is what is called as a telescopic nails, because in children bones are growing. So we can't put any growth rods. I mean the rods, intramedullary rods, which will destroy the growth plate. So there are some devices which can go through the growth plates, and they telescope to each other. There are two rods, one is male and female. So they telescope each other, and their limbs keep growing in the linear fashion. So this is one recent advances, and that's about osteogenesis imperfecta.
RP, before going further, two things. RP, before going further,
Yeah.
osteogenesis imperfecta, this is the one which leads to the pseudarthrosis, right?
No, pseudarthrosis is a different condition.
Okay, not related.
Pseudarthrosis is a different condition. Pseudarthrosis is nothing but pathological tissue in the bone in one area. So
Okay,
quite commonly associated with neurofibromatosis.
okay.
So in
Is this
children
also
who
the
have
condition where,
neurofibroma.
yeah, this also is a condition where there's a blue sclera. Is it the same case?
OI, osteogenesis imperfecta. It's one of the collagen disorder. So
Okay.
they can have blue sclera, laxity of the joints, and pathological fractures. Quite autosomal dominant. It runs in families also sometimes. So
Okay.
these are aspects. OI is different. Osteogenesis imperfecta, and pseudarthrosis of tibia is another condition. Pseudarthrosis can happen in any bone. Commonly happens in clavicle and tibia, but it can happen in radius, rarely in children. So there, again, challenging situations where we manage with bone grafting, intramedullary, external fixators. A lot of options are there. So that is a tissue in the hematomatous or pathological tissue in a local area. So it forms like a joint, and achieving a union is always a challenge. What are the other conditions you mentioned?
Osteoderma and exostosis.
Yeah, osteoderma is a benign bone tumor. Okay, it's a benign bone tumor commonly seen in metaphyseal ends of the long bones, and even in axial skeleton vertebral bodies also. So these vertebral bodies, pedicle or posterior elements of the vertebrae, it is seen. These osteodermas are nothing but local sclerosing tissues of the bone, which causes severe pain. And they always have a nidus, inflammatory nidus inside the sclerosed bone. And quite common presentation is the night pain. They have a severe night pains, and these children don't sleep at all. And it comes in morning times, they are quite fine, playful, but at night they have limited, quality of life because of the sleep disturbance. So a common area osteoderma which affects in the linear bones is the metaphyseal ends, especially around the neck of femur. So neck of femur, tibia, and tibial shaft, humerus. These are some of the areas. And the treatment is most of the time conservative. And there is a spontaneous resolution. Regression is also noticed. So whether you treat them or not, some children spontaneously, it can just disappear one fine day. With growth, usually it disappears. But if you see in a younger child like 7-8 years, they have a lot more growth happens in future. So these are the ones which pose problems, and we quite often they involve a surgical excision of this osteoderma lesion. Some areas are difficult, but it is there is no role for radiotherapy or anything in osteoderma. And surgical excision usually gives a fantastic relief of pain. Conservatively, another commonly used drug is aspirin. So that is in fact a diagnostic also. A night pain in a bone with a lesion in the sclerosed lesion in a bone, which is responding to aspirin, is more pathognomic of osteoid-osteoma. So these are some of the points about osteoid-osteoma. Another condition, benign condition commonly seen is osteochondroma, also called as a exostosis. So exostosis is common in the metaphyseal ends, again epiphyseal-metaphyseal regions where the growth is very fast. So you can, for a general surgeon, probably you can understand it is something like a bone herniation. Some of the cells which are in that area, which are not guided properly, they start growing outside, and this can be a problem. Especially the common presenting symptoms are the muscle attachments which are near to the joints. They get frequent irritation, and they can have a bursas. They can come with a history of frequent pains following more increased physical activity, or occasionally there can be a deformity as well. There can be a multiple osteochondromas as well, when where 1% of them turn into malignancy. Very, very rare. So in general, osteochondromas are benign, and if they are multiple, we don't recommend any surgery unless they are symptomatic. If it is solitary, we just observe them, and if depending on the area where they are coming from, and we decide whether to operate or not. Few other important points about osteochondroma is, so they are towards the knee, away from the elbow. So that is the easiest to remember. So these osteochondromas appear around the knee joint, that is distal end of the femur and proximal tibia, away from the elbow, that is in the distal radius and distal ulna, and proximal humerus. So these are common areas of the osteochondromas, and rarely they can be seen in ilium and scapula as well. The flat bones, very rarely seen in vertebral bodies and skull bones. So this is about osteochondroma. So anything else? I think we have covered most of the important aspects.
You covered everything, boss. I think they can give the MS orthopedics now. At least a fellowship course. Okay.
I just discuss whatever is important for them.
No, you did a brilliant job, and Abhishek, we're very impressed with the way you presented with conviction, with clarity, and you made all the points very well. And RP, as usual, a big thank you for agreeing at such short notice and presenting it so beautifully. I'm sure all of us are going to benefit. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, bye-bye.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks, RP.